It's another day and another example of Russia's brutality in Ukraine. Now, I'm aware that Russian state media has denied this, but frankly, I just don't think they have any credibility whatsoever because their lies have been proven time and time again. Remember, Russian state media and the Kremlin claimed they weren't going to invade Ukraine, and that's exactly what they've done days after those claims. So today, in the city of Kramatorsk, just check I'm pronouncing that right. Kramatorsk, excuse me. Um, there was an explosion at the train station. At least 50 civilians are dead. Refugees fleeing. There's toys strewn among the rubble. Cars are on fire. This is pure savagery. I mean, just as savage as ISIS attacking Kabul Airport last year. Um, And sometimes it's hard to really put something like that into words, especially when you're not there. I mean, for those of us watching, it's upsetting, it's distressing. One can only imagine if you have seen that directly or you've lost loved ones, um, the pain, the mental anguish. I can't comprehend what that would be like seeing children slaughtered. Um, I think Russia's claims of innocence are just a cruel joke at this stage. And I think, to me, this solidifies why it was justified blocking Russian state media. Free speech absolutists are a bit naive if they think that it's all a level playing field. When you have Russian state media telling the lies of the Kremlin, it's an insult to the victims of that regime, but um, it's just spreading lies. I mean, I don't think there should be a platform to do that. Um, and one can't help but also consider that years Russia propped up the murderous Assad regime in Syria. Now, throughout the 2010s, when the Syria war was raging and it's far from over, we shouldn't assume that war is over. People are still dying in Syria. Russia backed up Assad, but went further than that. Um, Russia bombed Syrian cities. Unquestionably, Syrian civilians also add to Putin's body count, bluntly. Um, and I remember how disgusted I was seeing the distortion of RT regarding the Syria war and the number of people that were willing to believe that, somehow suggesting that the chemical attacks at Ghouta and so on were staged by the CIA despite independent investigations. Um, So I do feel strongly that disinformation by totalitarian states is something that should be taken seriously. I think it's a form of it's a weapon, essentially. Um, what's disturbing also is that there is still, even now, there are people in the West, and I'm not talking about Russian nationals, I'm talking about Westerners who still advocate for Putin. It just defies belief. Even if they don't believe everything they see on Western media, you know, they logic doesn't follow because by extension they would have to be saying that the Ukrainian victims are just lying, and why? Well, they would be crying over their dead children to make Russia look bad, or an even more perverse conspiracy theory would be that Ukraine somehow doing it itself to make Russia look bad. I mean, the logic just makes no sense. It just makes zero sense. Um, the other issue is, the level of brutality that's going on, the level of deliberate targeting of civilians. Unfortunately, I think it is more than a few rogue elements of the Russian military. I think that there is an institutionalized brutality in the Russian military. And there may be some privates who are refusing to attack civilians who will be brave individual Russian troops who you always get this in wartime who don't want to follow along. I think the film Casualties of War, the Vietnam War film, where Michael J. Fox's character is kind of the lone voice and his unit's kind of gone rogue and they they take this girl and they rape her and so on, and he's, they then turn on him because he's trying to stop them. There will probably be incidents like that happening in Ukraine. But I have a theory actually, or I speculate rather, that the the way Russia treats its own troops is appalling. Hazing is a industrial level problem. I forget the Russian word for it, but it's a severe problem in the Russian military. I think being a Russian soldier must be one of the worst jobs in the world, because they're basically cannon fodder for the Kremlin. The Russian state doesn't give a damn about its own troops. I may talk about them being heroes and so on, but the way it treats them is absolutely appalling. The ratio of Russian casualties has been enormous. I saw one report suggesting that now, again, there will be some debate on the exact casualty figures, but if this is accurate or even near accurate, it's shocking. In the Vietnam War, the United States lost an average of 30 troops a day. In World War II, Britain lost an average of 180 troops a day. Apparently, the rate of Russian casualties is even higher than both of those. I forget what the figure was, but it was higher. Um, and certainly, if you do the maths, if the war's been going on for just over a month now, if you consider that, well, 24th of February, so yeah, just over a month, if you consider that even the conservative figures of 8,000 Russian dead, and it's probably higher, um, that works out at, you start adding that up. So my theory is that the level of Russian deaths is such that they're now taking out on civilians. They've seen their comrades killed and they take it out on the civilians. It's no justification, it's war crimes. And I think senior Russian officers should be um, tried in an international criminal court. I think every soldier abusing his position should, but that's not realistic. It isn't going to happen. So senior officers, generals, and so on should. There's never, ever an excuse for a soldier abusing a civilian. Never. Um, and I say that of any military. I think the Russians are particularly adept at it. But, I would say the same if an American or a British soldier was to abuse civilians. Um, and naive people think it never happens. It does. In the Vietnam War, of course, American troops were involved in massacres. Britain is not squeaky clean. Some conservatives here think that our military is, but I don't think it's comparable to what the Russians are doing right now. And the difference between Western militaries is at least there's investigations. It's not institutionalized from the top, as I think we're seeing with the Russian military. Um, I mean, for example, well, to use a famous example, the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, William Cayley, the officer involved in that, was court-martialed and sentenced to, I believe he was sentenced to death. Nixon pardoned him. Well, that was, exonerated from the top. But the very fact that he was arrested in the first place, that wouldn't happen with Russians. I think it's institutionalized in the Russian military. British soldiers. Um, there has apparently been yet another case related to Bloody Sunday or related to troubled deaths in Northern Ireland. My stance on that, and I'll just say this briefly because I don't want to draw direct analogies. I don't think it's the same thing. I think it's a totally, totally different scale. But I'll just draw on this briefly. Conservatives in mainland Britain are of the view that British soldiers done no bad things in Northern Ireland. I think that's wrong. I think it's misguided, and I think there were cases where civilians were killed by British troops. Bloody Sunday is a famous example, but there were others. There was Ballymurphy outside Belfast the year before. Um, the problem is with these troubles hearings is it looks like double standards where terrorists were freed for their crimes and they killed civilians. So it seems to me if British soldiers are going to be tried, these men are now in their 70s, and so should terrorists. There should be an applied standard. Um, and apparently parties across the board have agreed with that. But there are some right wingers who sort of think that it's unpatriotic to question if British troops ever done anything bad. I don't think it is. But I think there's when we're talking about Russia, I think the scale of atrocities is just staggering. I don't think it's been seen in Europe, with the big exception perhaps of the Balkans and Serb war crimes, since World War II. Regarding the Balkans, the Serbs are certainly responsible for a lot of atrocities, including Srebrenica, but it would be wrong to say it was just the Serbs. Also, that's slightly different from Ukraine. That wasn't an invasion. That was an ethnic conflict. It was within the former Yugoslavia. There were atrocities committed on both sides. With what's happening in Ukraine, there has been some reports of Ukrainians abusing Russian POWs, but Kiev has said that it takes it seriously and that will be investigated. Today, Ursula von der Leyen has essentially invited Kiev to join the EU. Um, I really think that it should. I think if that's what the Ukrainian people want, that should happen. But in terms of, I'm talking about war crimes, I'm talking about scale. I just mention that because people might get into whataboutery, like, well, the British done this. I take the view that there is never an excuse for a soldier to abuse a civilian. If a civilian is armed, they're militant. But even then, there's the Geneva Conventions, and there are ways to treat prisoners of war. So what Russia is doing is barbaric, and I don't know how anyone could rationally even try to condone it. Um, and this point has to be raised because it shouldn't be forgotten. Today, Dmitry Muratov, it might have been yesterday actually, the Nobel Peace Laureate, he's the editor of Novaya Gazeta, and he's a big critic of the Kremlin, was attacked with red paint on a Moscow train, or a Moscow bound train, and apparently there was some sort of acid in it because his eyes were burning. This is what happens to Russian dissidents. And in the West, we can. I think we should go after Putin loyalists definitely in terms of sanctions, but we shouldn't forget how brave it is for Russian dissidents and what they face. Apparently, when this attack happened, the assailant shouted out, "This is for our boys," implying that Muratov is unpatriotic. So, there is a real risk for Russian dissidents. They could go to jail for 15 years. They could be physically attacked. They're smeared as unpatriotic. I say it's precisely because they're doing the right thing. As far as I'm concerned, they're patriotic Russians because they see that Putin is destroying their country. He's destroying their international image. He's causing untold damage to Russia's international reputation. The sanctions are going to really hit ordinary people. So those Russians speaking out against Putin, they're not going against their country. They recognize that Putin is turning the world against Russia. At the UN human rights body, Russia was kicked out yesterday. Now, granted, that's a body that deserves a lot of scrutiny because some of the other members, the likes of Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, there's a lot of players there that really shouldn't be on the human rights body of all things. But the fact that Russia was kicked out, it's not a small thing. Um, I really do think that Putin has made Russia an international pariah. There's a very small number of countries that are really vocally supportive of Russia right now. Some of them are predictable, Belarus, perhaps some of the Central Asian states, North Korea. But even China is not going out of its way to defend Russia these days. That's saying something. I think maybe China is kind of watching to see what sort of international response there is. Perhaps they have in mind, well, would it be the same thing if we invade Taiwan? Um, or maybe the Beijing Moscow alliance wasn't as strong as it seemed. Maybe that was a facade. And actually, these two major powers can't really comfortably be that close. I mean, Russia and China haven't naturally had a strong history of allegiance, even though they were both communist states. There was the Sino-Soviet split of 1965. The truth is, Russia and China have never been that close. I think it's just because Putin and Xi see the West as in a collectively um, adversarial sense. And that's it, really. It's kind of shared adversary rather than a real ideological sympathy, although there's similarities, both are totalitarian states run by brutal dictators. But that's interesting. Um, what should be done? It's very difficult to know. I think at this point, a no-fly zone really it's a no-brainer. I just think even though well today's attack was apparently airborne, so unless it was a missile from the ground, that probably needs to be established. But um, that would be one big move. Certainly, arming continuing to arm Ukraine is one. Um, Countries like Poland and Hungary, despite its Putin stooge of a leader, have really been showing a lot of humanitarianism um, to the Ukrainian refugees. On Viktor Orban, I really think that Putin's stooges should be polarized. I think they should be isolated. I think Orban should be given a cold shoulder from, any sort of Western summits or EU summits, because the Hungarian people have been very hospitable to the Ukrainians, but Orban is just a Putin stooge. And I really think they deserve all the stigmatization they get, including, Westerners like I'll just say this briefly because I've already mentioned it, but Oliver Stone, this is a man who has made very powerful, poignant films about his experiences in Vietnam and about that. Yet he seems to have a real blind spot when it comes to Putin, and it's illogical. It's illogical. Oliver Stone's not a stupid man. So why is it that an influential Western filmmaker who could really use his influence for good, he could make a documentary about Ukraine, he could make a film about the courage of the Ukrainian people, but even now he's a Putin apologist. And there's quite a lot of them in the West. I think they now realize that they're in a minority, and I think they've become a little bit less vocal recently because I think they realize it's either guilt because they know they're wrong, or they know just how unpopular their opinion would be. And we have free speech in the West, but frankly, anyone who's prepared to defend Putin at the moment, I think they deserve as much stigmatization as they get. I'm not talking about physical threats. But yeah, I think there should be a stigma, quite frankly, supporting a dictator like Putin. I think that should attract stigma, because there's just no moral ground whatsoever to have that position, zero. And I think that it also it insults the victims of said tyranny. Um, but I do hope that senior Russian generals eventually end up as, in a international criminal court proceedings. Um, it's not unprecedented. I mean, there were the Nuremberg trials, or there were the Tokyo war crime trials. So it isn't impossible. It can happen. It's a long shot. The chances of Putin standing in the dock, I think, are extremely unlikely. I hope there's some sort of internal coup. It may be that Kremlin hardliners. It may be that a coup doesn't come from dissidents. It may be that a coup comes from Kremlin hardliners who don't want to get rid of Putin for moral grounds, but just because it's a ego thing. And that would be, I think Putin is a problem. Of course, it would be a problem just replacing Putin with another hardliner who would be anti-West and just as belligerent about Ukraine, maybe want to do it in a different way. Um, but at some point, Russia as a state is going to have to understand that Putin is the problem, and maybe that time it's sooner rather than later. One last thing, I thought this was a very good initiative and it's worth sharing. The Daily Mirror the other day had a very good idea. They had this headline. It's in Russian, and basically it's a message to the Russian people. They've got. I probably should have shown this at the start of the video because people don't watch a 20-minute video. But it's a letter in the Daily Mirror. It's from the 5th of April in Russian. Basically informing Russian people of what's going on. There's a site where you can find random addresses. I'll try and put that in the video, and you can basically send this to a Russian address. The idea being that if just one mind is changed, if people in Russia really start seeing a different perspective, the tide may turn against Putin. It's a long shot, but the Allies dropped leaflets during World War II. I think it's a similar concept. So I give the Daily Mirror credit for that idea. I think it's a good idea. Um, this is after the Bucha killings. this isn't going to end anytime soon. And Russia's brutality, it's sickening. It's going to cause, I think, really, really deep feelings in Ukraine for generations, understandably so. I think when it ends, Russia, if Putin is replaced, Russia will have to pay reparations to Ukraine for material damage, for lives lost, in the in billions. Because even if a reformer takes over, the Ukrainians are understandably going to there's going to be anti-Russian sentiments here for generations. I mean, how could you forget something like this? Anyway, I'll wrap this up. I'll put this maybe in the video link because chances of people watching the whole video, I know that hardly ever happens. I didn't intend it to be so long, but there was a lot to say. It's just barbaric what Russia is doing.